When President Trump announced his new tariff policies aimed at foreign trade, David's world began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. The president's sweeping changes, designed to protect American industries, were intended to create jobs and strengthen the economy. But for David, a 53-year-old financial consultant who had spent decades carefully planning for his retirement, the tariffs felt like a storm on the horizon. David had always been diligent about his financial planning. Over the years, he had invested heavily in a diversified portfolio, believing that this strategy would ensure his security once he retired. The stock market, though often volatile, had treated him well, until now. With Trump's tariffs taking effect, entire sectors of the market were thrown into turmoil, and David's investments were no exception. The companies David had trusted, tech giants, automotive manufacturers, and retailers, were hit hard by the tariffs. Overnight, their stock prices began to plummet, and David could do nothing but watch as his carefully planned retirement fund shrank. He had watched the market dip before, but this time was different. This wasn't just a minor correction, this was a policy shift with real, long-term consequences, and it was shaking the foundations of his financial future. David had always believed in the power of a diversified portfolio, that no matter the external factors, his investments would hold steady. But the reality was setting in, nothing was guaranteed. The financial stability he had relied on was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tariffs were directly impacting the industries he had invested in, and the stock market was feeling the ripple effects. As David sat at his desk that morning, staring at the plummeting numbers on his screen, his anxiety began to rise. His portfolio, which had been his safety net, was suddenly shrinking at an alarming rate. His retirement, once a promise of security and relaxation, was now a question mark. Would the money he had worked so hard to accumulate be enough? Or would this be the beginning of a much longer struggle to ensure his financial future? He knew he wasn't alone in this. Many Americans, especially those nearing retirement age, were facing the same uncertainty. The tariffs were designed to protect U.S. industries, but they were also creating instability in the global market, and those with long-term investments, like David, were bearing the brunt of the policy. David took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. He had been through market downturns before, and he knew that the best thing to do in moments like these was to remain calm. But as he scrolled through his investments, watching the value dip even further, his heart sank. The long-term plans he had crafted for retirement now seemed fragile, like sand slipping through his fingers. He picked up the phone and called his financial advisor, Jennifer. "David, I've been keeping an eye on the market," Jennifer said, her voice calm but with an undertone of concern. "These tariffs are having a bigger impact than we anticipated. We may need to reevaluate your portfolio and consider safer options." David rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The market was unpredictable, and the tariff policies, though aimed at helping certain industries, were wreaking havoc on others. He had worked his entire life to build this retirement plan, but now, everything was uncertain. Could he still retire on his timeline? Would his investments ever bounce back? David didn't have the answers. The policies, the market fluctuations, the tariffs, everything was out of his control. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, David wasn't sure what to do next. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself locked in an endless cycle of worry. Each morning, he would wake up with the same heavy thoughts, the same uncertainty about the future. He had always been a planner, a man who meticulously mapped out his life and his finances. But now, no matter how many spreadsheets or reports he reviewed, the numbers seemed to mock him. The market had plunged, his investments were losing value, and the world felt like it was spinning out of control. David knew he needed to make changes. The market volatility caused by the new tariff policies was too much for his portfolio to bear. But the question was, what changes should he make? He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of financial reports, trying to analyze his options. His pension, his savings, and his investments were supposed to be his safety net, but now they felt fragile. He had built a life around the idea that if he followed the right financial plan, he would be set for a comfortable retirement. But now, with the market in turmoil, that plan was beginning to look more like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse with every new news update. David had always been conservative with his finances. He'd avoided risky investments, sticking mostly to bonds and stocks from stable companies. But now, with tariffs causing entire sectors to tank, even his safe investments were taking a hit. Every time he checked his portfolio, it felt like he was watching his future slip through his fingers. He called his financial advisor, hoping for some reassurance, but even Jennifer, usually the calming voice of reason, sounded uncertain. "David," she said, "these are unprecedented times. The tariffs are shaking things up in ways we haven't seen before. It's going to take time to adjust, but I believe your portfolio is still solid in the long run." David could hear the hesitation in her voice. He didn't want to panic, but he also didn't want to ignore the reality of the situation. He had to consider all his options, not just trust that things would return to normal. The conversation ended with no clear answers. Jennifer suggested waiting for the markets to stabilize, but David wasn't sure he could afford to wait. Time was running out, and each passing day only made him feel more helpless. In the following days, David immersed himself in research. He combed through financial blogs, watched countless YouTube videos from so-called experts, and read books on diversification, risk management, and alternative investments. The more he learned, the more overwhelmed he became. There were so many strategies, so many different approaches, and none of them seemed like a perfect solution. Every choice felt like a gamble. If he pulled out of the stock market now, he might lock in his losses permanently. But if he stayed in, he risked losing even more. At night, he found himself unable to sleep, tossing and turning as his mind raced with numbers, percentages, and what-ifs. He would get up, sit at his desk, and open his laptop to check his investments, even though he knew it wouldn't make a difference. The screen glowed back at him with the same disappointing numbers. The uncertainty was eating away at him. It wasn't just the fear of losing money, it was the fear of not being able to provide for himself when he retired. He had worked his entire life for this moment, the freedom to relax, travel, and enjoy his golden years. But now, it seemed like the dream was slipping through his grasp, and no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he couldn't find a way to regain control. One evening, he decided to take a break from the endless cycle of research and analysis. He went for a walk in his neighborhood, hoping that the fresh air and quiet would clear his mind. But even as he walked down the familiar streets, his thoughts kept returning to his financial situation. How much longer could he go on like this? How much longer could he bear the stress of constant uncertainty? As he walked past the park, David watched the families enjoying the evening. Children were playing, couples were strolling hand in hand, and there was an overwhelming sense of calm in the air. David envied them. They seemed so carefree, so at ease. He couldn't help but feel out of place. Here he was, in the prime of his life, and all he could think about was how much longer he could keep up this fight. He stopped by the old oak tree in the park and sat on the bench beneath it, staring at the sunset. The colors in the sky were beautiful, but David couldn't fully appreciate them. All he could think about was the future, the retirement he had always planned for but now feared might never come. What if he never got to enjoy those years? What if he had to keep working, stuck in a job that drained him, just to stay afloat? David felt a lump form in his throat. He was tired of the uncertainty, tired of the constant worrying, and tired of not knowing what the future would bring. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over him, and allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to admit something. "I'm not sure what to do anymore." The weight of uncertainty pressed down on David every single day. He had always prided himself on his meticulous planning, his ability to anticipate what lay ahead. But now, nothing seemed certain. Each morning, as he opened his eyes and glanced at the clock, the nagging thought would immediately resurface: what happens if I don't have enough? David had always imagined retirement as a time to relax, to spend more time with his family, to travel, and to enjoy the fruits of decades of hard work. But as he faced the reality of the market downturn, that dream seemed to slip further and further out of reach. the volatility of the stock market had left David feeling like a bystander in his own financial future. He had invested heavily in sectors that were now being pummeled by tariffs and international trade wars. Every time he checked the news, it seemed like the world was getting a little more unpredictable. Prices were rising, policies were shifting, and his investments were shrinking. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee and read the latest headlines, the weight of his worry grew heavier. It wasn't just the financial loss, it was the fear of an unknown future. David felt like he was teetering on the edge of something he couldn't control, a future that had once seemed clear but now seemed clouded by doubt. The numbers no longer made sense, the projections no longer offered comfort. What had once felt like a secure future now felt like a precarious house of cards. At work, the pressure of his personal financial stress was starting to spill over. David had always been the one colleagues turned to for advice, the calm and collected professional who had everything together. But lately, he had been struggling to focus, his mind constantly drifting back to his portfolio, the tariffs, and the future. When he had a meeting with a client, he would go through the motions, but inside, he felt like he was suffocating. His confidence, which had always been his strongest trait, was now replaced with doubt and insecurity. One afternoon, he sat at his desk, staring blankly at a report. The numbers were starting to blur. His thoughts kept returning to his retirement plans, the very ones that now seemed so fragile. He had always told himself that he would be fine, that the strategy he had built would carry him through. But now, those reassurances felt empty. Could he still retire at 65? Could he still live the life he had imagined, or was he going to be forced to work for much longer than he had planned? The more David thought about it, the more it felt like his entire world was slipping through his fingers. He had worked so hard to build this life, but now, it seemed like one policy change or one market downturn could undo everything. The realization hit him hard: what if I can't rely on the plans I've spent so long building? What if I've been too confident? That night, David sat in his living room, the weight of the day's thoughts pressing on his chest. The news was on in the background, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was elsewhere, trying to process the overwhelming sense of uncertainty. He picked up his phone and glanced at the stock market app. The numbers hadn't improved. His investments were still in the red, and the forecast didn't look any better. He put the phone down and looked around the room. His comfortable home, the furniture, the bookshelves filled with years of memories, all seemed so distant in that moment. He was no longer thinking about the present or enjoying the comfort of his home. He was consumed by the fear of what was to come, by the possibility that the future he had worked so hard to secure was no longer guaranteed. David thought about his retirement dreams, the trips he wanted to take with his wife, the time he wanted to spend with his kids and grandchildren. But now, those dreams seemed uncertain. He wondered if he would ever get the chance to enjoy them, or if he would be stuck working far longer than he had ever planned. Chasing after a future that was slowly slipping away, that night, he couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept swirling in his mind, relentless and heavy. He felt like he was in a storm, with no clear direction. The future was now a blur of doubt and fear. And in the quiet of the night, as he lay awake in bed, David wondered if the dream of a peaceful retirement was nothing more than an illusion. David's life had always been about control. He had built his career meticulously, planned his finances carefully, and felt confident in his ability to navigate life's ups and downs. But now, the ground beneath him felt shaky. The financial uncertainties that had crept into his life had begun to affect every corner of his existence. And the weight of it all was starting to feel unbearable. Each day, he would wake up, make his coffee, and sit down to check his investment accounts. His mind would race as he saw the market's fluctuations. Some days, it seemed like things were stabilizing, and then others, it would plummet again. His portfolio, which once seemed like a safe, growing asset, now felt like a ticking time bomb. The stock market was one thing, but the real pressure was the thought of his future, his retirement. The image of sitting back, enjoying a peaceful life, traveling, and spending time with his family was now tainted by an overwhelming fear of not having enough. David couldn't escape the thought that if he didn't make the right decisions now, his retirement would be nothing more than a distant dream. At work, David tried to stay focused. He had responsibilities, clients to manage, and projects to oversee. But every time he looked at the numbers on his screen or saw a news headline about the economic downturn, his mind would wander back to the same haunting question: what if I'm not ready? It was a silent battle. He didn't speak much about it to anyone, not to his colleagues, not to his friends, and certainly not to his family. There was pride in David, an unspoken expectation that he should be able to handle this alone. He had always been the one others turned to for advice, for guidance, for reassurance. But now, there was no one to turn to. His confidence had been replaced with doubt, and it was eating at him every day. His evenings were filled with restless thoughts. The moment he got home, he would retreat to his living room, open his laptop, and dig deeper into articles about market trends, tax policy changes, and retirement saving strategies. Each article seemed to provide a new layer of information that only made him more confused. Was his strategy wrong? Should he sell off more of his assets? Should he invest in something safer, something more predictable? Every decision felt like it could be the wrong one, and the pressure of that decision-making weighed heavily on him. The options he had once felt confident about now seemed too risky, too uncertain. The more he learned, the more he realized just how little he understood about the complex financial landscape he was navigating. The more David researched, the more questions he had, and the less clear the answers became. His physical health was starting to show signs of strain. He found himself losing sleep, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing over numbers and scenarios. His once consistent morning jogs had become fewer and farther between, replaced by hours spent on the couch, scrolling through endless financial reports. His usual appetite for meals had dwindled, and when he did eat, it was usually something quick and easy, not the healthy meals he used to enjoy. He knew it wasn't good, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't focus on anything but the worry. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, David decided to go for a walk. He needed to clear his head, anything to break the cycle of constant worry. He walked along the quiet street near his house, the cool night air helping to calm his mind, if only for a moment. He wasn't thinking about the stock market or his investments. Instead, he thought about the years ahead. What would they look like now? His walk led him to a small park near his neighborhood. It was a peaceful spot, with a few benches under the trees, the lights from the street lamps casting a soft glow across the grass. David sat on one of the benches, watching as the night unfolded around him. A few joggers passed by, some older couples taking a leisurely stroll, and children playing in the distance. They all seemed so relaxed, so carefree. He couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. Here he was, in the prime of his life, and yet he felt a world apart from them. He should have been enjoying his life, but instead, he was weighed down by uncertainty. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had done everything right, followed all the rules, worked hard, saved diligently. But now, it felt like all his efforts might have been in vain. He leaned back on the bench, staring at the stars. The silence of the night was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. For a moment, David allowed himself to simply exist, to let go of the pressure he had placed on himself. There was nothing he could do right now. The markets would do what they would do, and he had already taken the steps he could to protect himself. But the fear of what was to come still loomed large in his mind. David stood up, stretched, and made his way home. As he entered his house, the quietness seemed to engulf him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep carrying this weight on his own. The constant worry was draining him, and he needed to find a way to regain control of his life, his health, and his future, but what that way was, David still didn't know. For now, all he could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. It had been weeks since David first felt the sting of his investments taking a dive. In that time, his anxiety had only deepened. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee, he would stare at the numbers on his phone or computer screen, watching as the value of his stocks continued to dip. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. He knew what was coming, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had made all the right moves, invested wisely, and yet, the market had betrayed him, and he could feel it pulling him under. As he walked to his office one morning, the weight of everything seemed to bear down on him even more. It wasn't just the money, it was the life he had planned for, the life he had worked so hard for, that now seemed uncertain. The financial freedom he had dreamed of in retirement was slipping away, and David had to face the reality that he might have to adjust his entire plan. It wasn't just about selling off stocks or finding safer investments, it was about something deeper. Could he still retire in peace, or was he facing a future of constant struggle? At work, David tried to focus on his tasks, but it was almost impossible. His mind kept returning to his investments. He couldn't shake the feeling that every decision he had made had led him to this moment of doubt. Had he been too aggressive with his portfolio? Had he placed too much faith in the system that had always been his safety net? What would he do if this downward spiral continued? Would he have to go back to work long after retirement? That evening, he sat in his living room, staring blankly at the wall. His phone buzzed with a message from his friend, Mark, asking if he wanted to meet up for a drink. David hesitated for a moment before replying, "Sure, I'll be there." It wasn't that he felt like talking about his financial problems, it was more about escaping the relentless anxiety that had started to consume him. Maybe being around someone else would help him forget, even if just for a little while. As David drove to the bar, he tried to push the worries to the back of his mind, but they crept in like shadows, ever present. When he met Mark, they exchanged pleasantries, but it didn't take long before the conversation turned to business, then to the markets. Mark, a fellow investor, had his own opinions about the tariffs and market volatility. "You holding steady?" Mark asked, taking a sip of his beer. David shrugged. "Trying to. It's just hard to ignore the numbers, you know." Mark nodded. "I hear you. But you can't control what's happening. You've just got to adjust and wait for it to pass. I know it's tough, but the market always bounces back." David looked at Mark and tried to smile. It always bounces back, he thought to himself, but there was a nagging feeling deep inside that told him this time might be different. What if it doesn't bounce back? What if this was the beginning of a new reality, one that he hadn't planned for, one that he couldn't control? "Yeah," David said quietly, "I know. I just can't help but feel like it's all slipping through my fingers." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" David paused, staring into his drink. "I've spent my whole life saving for this, retirement, freedom from all this stress. But now, I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle. The investments, the market, everything is just out of my hands. I don't know what to do anymore." Mark looked at him with concern. "David, I get it. But don't let the uncertainty drive you crazy. I mean, this is what we do, right? We plan, we adjust, and we weather the storm. You've got time. You don't need to make any rash decisions now." David didn't respond right away. He just stared at the amber liquid in his glass, feeling a heavy lump in his throat. Time. He kept hearing that word, time. But how much time did he have left to adjust? How many more years could he afford to take these hits? Time felt like a luxury he might not have. As they continued talking, David felt the walls of his own thoughts closing in. Mark was right in a way, he did have time. But there was also a sinking realization that the life he had imagined, the retirement he had hoped for, might be fading into something unrecognizable. Every time the market faltered, it reminded him that nothing was guaranteed. By the time he left the bar, David felt no better than when he had walked in. The weight of the doubt continued to settle over him, thick and suffocating. He was still unsure of how to move forward, and the uncertainty gnawed at him like a constant companion. He didn't know if he could ever go back to the carefree, confident person he once was. The weeks had passed slowly for David, each one blending into the next, filled with the same anxieties, the same thoughts swirling around in his mind. He had made adjustments to his investments, but the weight of uncertainty still hung heavily on him. Every time he checked his account balances, there was a familiar pang of unease. The losses hadn't been fully recovered, and the market continued to feel volatile. It was difficult to shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, with no net below to catch him if he fell, but in the midst of this turmoil, something had changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but more of a quiet realization that perhaps there was still a way forward. Even if it wasn't a perfect path. David had been so focused on his losses that he hadn't fully considered the opportunities for adjustment that lay right in front of him. One evening, as he sat in his living room, staring out the window at the distant lights of the city, his phone rang. It was his financial advisor, Jennifer. He hadn't heard from her in a while, and he braced himself for another round of market analysis and cautionary advice. But this time, her tone was different. "David, I've been reviewing your portfolio again," Jennifer said, her voice calm but assured. "I know it's been a tough couple of months, but I want to tell you, there's still room to turn this around. We need to take a step back and look at your strategy more holistically. There are some adjustments we can make that will help weather this storm and maybe even set you up for the long term." David sat up straighter, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. For so long, it had felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, unsure of how to secure his future. But here, in Jennifer's words, he could hear a sense of possibility. "What kind of adjustments are you talking about?" David asked. His voice steady but filled with curiosity. Jennifer continued, "We've been too focused on short-term market fluctuations. We need to diversify more, expand into safer assets, and maybe take some of your funds out of sectors that are being hit hard by the tariffs. There are other, more stable investment opportunities that can help buffer against the volatility we've been seeing." David listened carefully as Jennifer outlined a new plan, more conservative, more balanced, but still with room for growth. She wasn't offering empty promises, but instead, a well-thought-out strategy that made sense given the economic climate. It was a plan that didn't rely on hoping the market would suddenly bounce back. Instead, it was about adjusting expectations and building a financial cushion that would hold up, no matter how the markets moved. When the call ended, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't a solution that erased all of his concerns, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a roadmap, something concrete to hold on to. He wasn't at the mercy of the markets, he had options, and those options were within his control. Over the next few days, David worked with Jennifer to implement the new strategy. It wasn't easy, and it took a lot of careful consideration. He had to adjust his mindset, letting go of his attachment to the growth-heavy investments that had once seemed like the ticket to a secure retirement. It wasn't a loss of hope, but a shift towards something more sustainable. As he made the necessary changes, David began to feel a sense of empowerment return. He wasn't passively waiting for the markets to turn in his favor, he was actively reshaping his future, even if it meant taking a longer, steadier route. The discomfort he had been feeling for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence in the choices he was making. A few weeks later, David went for a walk in the park near his apartment. It had become his place of reflection, a place where he could clear his head and take in the beauty of the world around him. The trees were beginning to bloom, and the scent of spring was in the air. As he walked along the path, he realized something that took him by surprise. He had found peace. It wasn't peace in the way he had always imagined it, there was still uncertainty ahead, still challenges to face. But now, he understood that peace didn't come from having everything figured out. It came from accepting the unknown and knowing that, even when things weren't perfect, he had the tools to manage whatever came his way. He thought about his investments, about his retirement plans, and about the long road ahead. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of it. The markets would go up and down, the world would continue to change, but David now knew that he could navigate it. He wasn't powerless. He had made adjustments, and he had regained control. As he stood still for a moment, taking in the tranquility of the park, David felt a sense of gratitude for the opportunity to adapt. In the face of adversity, he had found a path forward, not because it was easy, but because he was willing to face the uncertainty head-on. And in that, He had found his strength. The days that followed the realization of how fragile his financial future had become were filled with a quiet, lingering anxiety. David had made the decision to adjust his investment strategy, selling off some stocks, reallocating funds, but even as he took these steps, the uncertainty never fully left him. The constant worry about his future hung in the air like a thick fog. Never quite clearing, David found himself at a crossroads. It was a moment of reflection, a place where he could no longer ignore the doubts that had settled deep within him. The weight of his decisions, and the consequences of the policies beyond his control, pressed down on him. While some of his financial worries had been eased by shifting his investments, there was no real certainty about what lay ahead. The world outside was unpredictable, and no amount of preparation seemed to guarantee peace of mind. As he walked down the quiet, sunlit streets of his neighborhood, David began to wonder, had he done enough? Could any strategy truly offer the security he had once envisioned for his retirement? Every step he took felt like a step into the unknown. A journey where the destination was unclear. David found himself thinking about the larger picture. The markets would always have their ups and downs. Government policies, changes in the global economy, these things were beyond his control. He had worked hard, saved diligently, and planned for the future, yet it seemed as though all his efforts could be undermined by forces outside his grasp. As he sat down on a bench in the park, watching the leaves blow gently in the breeze, he couldn't help but reflect on his journey. What really matters now? Was it the security of a well-planned financial future, or was there something deeper, something intangible that he hadn't considered? For the first time in a long while, David didn't feel the need to rush into a solution. He didn't feel the need to immediately solve everything. He let his mind wander. What would it be like to accept the unknown? To acknowledge that control is an illusion, and maybe, just maybe, it's okay to not have everything figured out. He realized that perhaps the hardest part of this journey wasn't about finding the perfect investment strategy or ensuring his future comfort. The hardest part was coming to terms with the unpredictability of life. It was about accepting the reality that no one, no matter how well they plan, can ever truly have total control over their fate. David had spent so many years trying to build an unshakable foundation. But now, he found himself asking, what if stability wasn't about the money, the investments, or the plans at all? What if it was about the ability to face uncertainty with courage? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, David felt a strange sense of peace. The financial worries still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. He realized that sometimes, there is no perfect answer. Sometimes, the path forward is not about controlling everything but learning how to navigate the uncertainty with resilience, and in that moment, David let go of the need for certainty. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe that was okay. Life was unpredictable, and that was its own kind of beauty.